Get there. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Digby. I am the chairman of the Event Safety Alliance, a nonprofit foundation which was started on the heels of the 2011 Indiana State Fair stage collapse, which unnecessarily killed 7 people. The major thought behind why people died at that event is a weather event. The truth is, thankfully, because we can't change the weather, people died because of a lack of a plan, a lack of an executable plan. So in the wake of that, the Event Safety Alliance was born. We're a nonprofit entity advocating for better safety practices across the live event industry throughout the globe. In our first year and a half, we published the first of its kind in the United States, Safety for Live Events Handbook. This was modeled after the Purple Guide in the UK, so there's good resources behind it. It is meant to apply globally, hence the globe. On your way out, Jimmy Chan will hand out some brochures so you can know more about it. The other success of the Event Safety Alliance is that we now have available online basic safety training, which many of you know doesn't exist at all in the industry. It's one of the greatest things about it. Anybody can do it. Look around the room. But it's also the biggest problem. We don't have a basic safety induction for working in our space, and I think we should. Introducing to you Mr. Greg Gillen. Greg, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm the Senior Vice President for Venue Development in Live Nation Emerging Markets, which is everything bar the US, UK and Europe. And my responsibility is finding new venues for us and also helping our promoters through greenfield sites and also putting shows on through places like China and Japan, where the venue management industry isn't as competent as what we would expect in the more developed world.
And Rob Spitzer.
Hi, I'm Rob Spitzer, the Senior Vice President for Asia at AEG Presents. AEG Presents is our live entertainment division covering mostly music, but also some sports and other live events and festivals and things. Our region of Asia actually spans from Japan all the way to India and Dubai and down to Australia and New Zealand. So it's a very broad region that we work in, and we certainly deal with a variety of factors, all very different from country to country.
Thank you, Rob. And what those folks well, let's have the graphic, please. So what those folks who just left will miss is that 54% of the audience cares about what happens with their safety and security in a recent poll in the wake of the attacks in Manchester. The poll was conducted on behalf of Music Matters by the official research partner YouGov. And you'll see here of the respondents, quite a few folks are concerned about their safety at events, which is why we're talking about it today. The first question that we'd like to ask you two fine men is, how has the recent event in Manchester, the Ariana Grande event, the Christina Grimmie event where the artist was killed at a meet and greet, how have those moments in time impacted your work, and what's changing as a result of it? Greg, if you'll give us a start there.
Yeah, look, I think it certainly had an impact. I think it's also had an impact on the wrong people. It's certainly impacting the statutory authorities, the licensing authorities, who are now starting to tighten up how we manage venues, how we build greenfield sites. And it's also having an impact on the artists who are now basically mandating, we want to have this, this and this. Ariana Grande is a perfect example where she's essentially saying, no bags, nothing at all, which has a huge impact on the patron. But what we're not seeing at the moment, certainly through emerging markets, is the venues standing up and saying, right, okay, this is how we're going to target harden our venue. This is how we're going to train our staff and develop our security culture, which is a little bit disappointing. At the moment, it feels like the licensing authorities and the artists have to lead the way. And my personal belief is that the security industry should be taking more of a lead in managing the risk around places of mass gatherings.
Let me take a quick poll. How many in the room are venue operators or owners or managers? Great. And then those who are artist representatives of any kind? Great. And then Operations, I guess, is what's left, yeah? Folks who are doing operations? Okay. Rob, tell us whose duty of care it is for the audience when they come into a venue.
I think I'd agree with Greg. It's everyone's duty. I think the issue is to figure out how to coordinate that, because the artists come in with all of their requirements, production requirements, logistic requirements, and obviously security requirements, and that's not new. They've always had, expectations of artist security to keep the artist safe, event security, and crowd control, but it was really just driven from their side. And they, I know from having worked with artists, there's always the expectation from the artist side. From the venue side, they generally follow what the local regulation is. And in some places, the regulation is somewhat deficient, and unfortunately, the venues are really, following or not even following whatever level that, was set for them by a governmental body. So I think it's tough for the audience to know who's responsible for their care. But I certainly agree with the half of the audience that does, have concern about it. They have every right to be concerned, but they also should have some expectation of their own responsibility. And I mean that only that, if there are security procedures that are being put in place, then they have to know about them by reading or understanding what the regulations or requirements are in that venue, by allowing enough time to go through that entry procedure, the same as you would in an airport or any other sort of secured area. I think the audience is going to have a more involved role in their own care.
I think in the U.S., where lawyers are a dime a dozen, sadly, the duty of care boundary runs more or less with the host nation. The host venue has the duty of care for the audience. The artist has a duty of care for those elements that come along with the artist, the trucks, the buses, the staff. And the line is drawn fairly cleanly between the two. So if you're the venue operator, you really are the one who's charged with having the plan and understanding how to execute the plan and what the timeline is to execute your plan with respect to safety. And if you're the artist, you're charged with making sure that those things under your sphere of influence can easily evacuate and easily get to safety. Greg, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I'd like to also qualify my comment about I think it's the venue's responsibility, and that's the gap that has to be filled. I've spent the last 25 years working for venues, and it's not often that I will sympathise with promoters. I now work for promoters, but in this case I do. We spent a lot of time in the venues that I worked at getting our procedures right, familiarising those procedures with the police, the fire brigade, the army, or the first responders, and it was a big part of our management plan and risk. And the promoters come in and they're in our venue for the better part of maybe 3 days, maybe 4 days, and now they're expected to run the venues. Now, a lot of the venues that we have out here in Asia are government run, so what we're seeing more and more is the government facilities are saying, there's the keys, we're back on Monday, good luck, don't break it. Which again is very, very difficult for our promoter friends, and that's why I tend to feel for them. And then there's another entity to this, which is not just the response plan or the incident management planning, but it's your life safety systems as well. We walk into so many venues now throughout Southeast Asia or emerging markets, and you pop open a fire hydrant cupboard, and you can see straight away that valve has been rusted shut for the last 20 years. The hose is degraded and you're never going to pump water through it. So all of a sudden, you're on the back foot if you have an interest in providing a safe event. So that was around the reason for my comment. And it doesn't take a lot to do this. No one knows your venue better than you. I can't come into your venue and say, hey, look, this is how people are going to react in relation to an emergency. You work in it every day. So the onus is on you to try and make sure that your venue is as safe as possible.
What new precautions are you seeing come into play now as a result of Manchester and other recent incidents?
Look, we're definitely seeing governments now and licensing authorities dropping concrete blocks as hostile vehicle mitigation and mandating more safety checks. But that creates a secondary problem. I mean, I looked at a case down at the MCG on the weekend, which is the better part of about 105,000 seat stadium. It's the first round of the finals down in Melbourne, and they went through a very robust checking process. But as a result, you probably had about 50,000 people outside the ground. Now, anyone who walks up with a backpack and a ripcord gets the maximum damage there. So a procedure that they've put in place to try and make the venue safer is actually created as a secondary hazard, just because they haven't really thought through the problem. Now, we had this again, I was working at Wembley. You get any FA Cup, any Champions League final, Wembley Way, at the better part of half an hour before the game, you would have 60,000 people on that approach. It takes a little bit more thought, but as I said, no one knows your venue better than you, and if we allow the licensing authorities or the police to manage them for us, what's inevitably going to happen is reduced capacity and also a diminished patron experience, because the police and licensing authorities don't understand our venues as well as we do.
And Rob, on the promoter side, what new challenges are you seeing that are either artist-induced or venue-induced? I'm sure you're getting it from both ends, but what new challenges are there?
Yeah, certainly from the artist side, like I said before, they've always been concerned about safety and security, but this is obviously another whole level where it's not just about preventing an overeager fan from getting backstage, or making sure that the barricade is comfortable, or at least safe, if not comfortable, up in the front of the crowd. Now it's artists are taking a much more active role in concerns that have come from these tragic events, and for us as promoters to be able to respond to their requirements and give them a level of information and a coordinated plan, whether that's evacuation or any other sort of preparedness related planning. We have a lot more work to do in advance. It isn't just figuring out where the security guards are going to stand, or whether people can or cannot bring in a large size camera. And not to harp on it, but really a lot of it does go back to the venue side. And I work in a company that has a lot of venues, and I know that their costs and their workload for security has just absolutely increased, because it isn't enough as promoters. We can't just say, okay, security starts at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of the show. It has to be every day. It has to be all the time. It doesn't help if we're safe, for a few hours before a concert. If somebody has, come in and introduce some kind of threat or danger 2 days before. It doesn't help if we only screen the patrons that are coming to come and see the show. Of course, we do have to screen 100% of the patrons, but are we effectively screening 100% of the workers? Are we, effectively, watching the back door, so to speak, as much as the front door?
And the Event Safety Alliance would contend that another key element here is to raise the bar on the kind of people we're putting in these front lines. And again, that goes back to the crew having safety training, which includes things like CPR and active shooter training. And I would argue that the frontline T-shirt security staff can no longer just be the guy you find on the street, you've thrown a shirt on him and you fed him lunch and now he's security for the day. I don't think that plan is any longer effective. And in the UK, those who are monitoring safety on the audience side have a quite rigorous training that they go through that helps them to understand what to do in the event of an active shooter or potential mass casualty. So they're not just stunned and stumped when that kind of thing happens. They can actually help to get people to evacuation. And I think globally, we've got to raise the bar of those folks.
And I think it's not just about that licensing process either. It's about the induction into the venue, knowing what the alert tone sounds like, knowing what the evacuation tone sounds like, knowing where the emergency evacuations are, knowing what the communication or the show stop procedure is. These are all things that the venue should be inducting into the ongoing security or the crowd control. And then you've got the asset the asset security. Now, they're just as important on the lead up to an event, as Rob was saying before. Is our venue sterile? But we've seen so many times before where we've had attacks on venues that's not the first time that individual who's attacked the venue has been to the venue. So making awareness of hostile reconnaissance and making sure your asset security is questioning anyone who's taking the photo of the exit door or the arch base or, the fire entry and say, look, can I help you? Getting that awareness and saying, look, we're not the soft target you think we are, go down the road. So it's a combination of the two different types of security that's going to help keep you safe.
Well, and there's a good example there in the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. The press would have you believe that was a result of a person who had an ideological difference with the kind of patrons that were going to that club, when in a matter of fact, that person had scouted Disney World and several other venues around Orlando prior to choosing Pulse nightclub. And what he found in at Disney World, and the Disney has the best toys on the planet when it comes to safety and security. And they spotted this guy coming in a couple of days before and knew immediately that there was something suspicious about him. And when he tried to enter the park, he saw a great security presence there, turned around and walked out. But in the meantime, he had bought something in the merch store, so he had captured his name and all those other details. But the point of that is he felt that target was too hardened. He felt that it was not going to be easy enough for him to get through that front line of defense and create hazard destruction. So he chose not to use Disney World. So that goes to your point that, if you can present, for lack of a better description, a bulldog appearance around your entire venue, there's no open doors that are blocked and there's no easy way in, and everybody who comes in and comes out of your venue is scrutinized. That is a good frontline defense, and that doesn't take anything more than the well-trained staff or the staff that you already have on hand with better training. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think from the artist side, for me, the artist venue touring security teams have always been more or less bouncers or ex-football players who really don't have much training, and especially have no training in the kind of things that we're talking about. So on Lincoln Park, I was in the process of rewriting what the artist venue security guys were, and that was a two-person team, one of which was an event and crowd management safety specialist, someone who knew that the rigging didn't look right, but also went around and checked that there were no exit doors chained shut, and knew how to handle audience members coming over the barricade. That was person one. And then person two was someone with more traditional counterterrorism training, like an ex-military type person. And not all ex-military work in this role, but this person's job was to plan our emergency evacuation route, to mark those routes from the dressing room and from the stage, and to make sure that we had cars pre-positioned in the event of an incident. And so this is a two-pronged, much higher level ask of our touring artist venue safety guys than I think is out there at all. And that's a change that I think is coming as well.
It is, and I think what we saw certainly with Lincoln Park in China and some of the stadiums there, that's absolutely required. When you start to ask the venue managers or the venue owners, well, how do we get people in, how do we get people out, and you start to get a little bit worried when they scratch their head and say, well, you should know the answer to that question. Well, we're only here for 5 days.
We should be very careful, though. Of course, we really are hearing this term, a hardened target. Not that we wish anyone else, ill will, but we have to protect, our events, our audiences, our artists, our venues. But to be clear, it isn't just the appearance of security. It has to be real security. And in too many cases, we've come across, some sort of setup that's, I don't want to say fake security, but it has the appearance of a more secure implementation than it really is, and that doesn't work. You can't screen half the people coming in. You can't look at some of the bags. You can't cover most of the doors, or some of the staff. If it isn't going to be complete and thorough, then it shouldn't be there. Or a better way to say that is, it has to be complete and thorough. It can't have big holes on it. We're not just doing it for theater. We're not just doing it for appearances.
It's not perception only.
While we're happy for everyone to see and understand that an event and a building is secure, it has to be real.
Yeah, and I would argue that in the immediate aftermath of the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, the cry went out: magnetometers. Everybody put up magnetometers. Everybody put up wands. Well, the magnetometer is only a tool in the toolbox, and it's only as good as the person who's operating it. And if that person who's operating it doesn't have the capability of disarming and incapacitating the person who's going to do harm, all you've done is move the target zone to the magnetometers instead of inside the building now.
Well, in the UK, there was a few cases where they replaced sort of more commonly used security personnel with military personnel,
right,
who have obviously a much more visible and striking presence, but they were actually less trained in those venues. They were less trained in that role. They might be great in certain military roles, but they weren't trained for the type of security that they were being asked to do. So while it may look reassuring and it may make a patron feel like, wow, there's a very high level of security here because there's military personnel safeguarding the space. If they're not the right people for it, if they haven't received the right training, that's not what we're after.
It's funny you bring it up because in the immediate aftermath, in Orlando, where in a country that doesn't love its guns, all the roadies were talking about, well, I'm going to carry a gun. I'm bringing a gun in my road case. That is not the answer either. That is not a trained person. And what does a roadie look like? In a black T-shirt, black pants, all dressed up and sweaty, looks like a terrorist. So we don't advocate that. Go ahead, Greg.
I think that there is no perfect solution, but the solution that we've got so far is a good one, and that is doing the basics right. It is getting your training right, it is understanding your venue, it is doing your threat and your vulnerability assessments once a year. It's dusting off your incident management planning and making sure it's known, doing the tabletop exercises with the police and the fire brigade once a year, having a person responsible for security. And not leaving it to the event manager, because you know damn well that it's left to the event manager. Well, the event manager is an event manager first and foremost, and they'll be doing the security off the corner of their table. We can't stop someone showing up to our venue with an automatic weapon or a backpack full of explosives. But what we can do is we can minimise the damage they can do. We can be reactive. We can make sure that our site is safe before we invite people onto the site. It's not rocket science, and it just takes a little bit of time. That's really the most of it. You don't have to spend millions of dollars in target hardening your venue. It's an investment in time and training.
And planning.
Yeah.
Is anyone in the room aware of a publication called Inspire? Inspire is a magazine put out by ISIS, Daesh, routinely. And in this magazine, routinely, we all are the targets. Sporting events, live music events, any place where there is a mass gathering, they talk about us in this magazine routinely. And it's frightening to know that that's the case, but it should also be a wake-up call that those who are intending to do harm are actually thinking about you right now. And in the case of Manchester, I would argue, I don't know what plan or what process would have changed the outcome of that. There are going to be moments that we're going to have to deal with these things again, even with the best plans.
That's right.
But I would certainly rather be well-equipped with a plan and well-equipped with an informed and trained team, because it increases my odds and your odds for survival.
Yeah, and this is also, the topic we're talking about today, be it counter-terrorism or venue attacks or places of mass gathering attacks, it's a small part of what we have to deal with in relation to safety and security. There's just as many stage collapses, there's just as many weather incidences that we have to be focused on. And what I'm finding more and more now is venues are so blinkered into, well, how are we going to stop the guy with the gun? So, okay, well, before we worry about that, let's make sure that our temporary stand is right. Let's make sure that our temporary rigging structure and stage has the right engineering specifications, and the structural engineers have told us it's safe before we start loading the artist and 70-tonne worth of equipment on top of it. these are the other things we need to be focusing on.
And I would argue that that's, in the probability scale, the likelihood of a catastrophic weather event affecting an improperly constructed stage is much greater than a terrorist event. So while the topic today is what's happened in the wake of Manchester, there are a whole bunch of other things you got to get right first, or in addition to. And that is especially true, I think, if you know that your infrastructure is built correctly, the stage is built correctly, you have a weather action plan, you have all the other tools in place to cover those things that are the more common threats, it allows you more time and energy to focus on the least common threats. Some of the training I received taught us the axiom MOM, maxim of maxims. And that means if you train to a thunderstorm and the hurricane comes or the typhoon comes, you're undertrained for the typhoon. But if you train to the typhoon and the thunderstorm comes, you're really well equipped to deal with that. So always train to the highest level threat you possibly can, tabletop exercise that threat, put your teams through it, find, every night, time how long it takes your audience to leave the venue, and you can, on a good day, and then make sure you write the weather conditions down as well, or what the artist was as well, and develop your own metric for how long that venue takes to go to clear on a good day. And now use that metric. If people say, well, how long is it going to take for you to evacuate everybody? I don't know. I've never had an evacuation. But you've emptied your venue every night. How long has that taken? So somewhere in there, there's some mathematics that worked, how you use that number to understand how long it's going to take you to evacuate your venue. And I would argue you do it on the sunny day number.
That's right. And I think the other, just to add to that, is talk to your casual staff. They're your eyes and ears. Do the debriefs on the night, the hot debriefs, because you're going to learn so much more around how patrons move around your venue, what the issues are in their area. They may be seeing an exit light out. They may be seeing a fire extinguisher that's not to code or hasn't been serviced.
Locked doors.
Locked doors, those types of things. So even though they're there 3, 4, 5 hours, maybe a month, maybe a fortnight, they've got a lot to offer because they're standing on that door. They have a responsibility. So get around your venue and have a chat to them. Learn from them.
Yeah.
Also, I think another important aspect of all this is the communication protocols. You've got the artist team focused on the show they're putting on, or the sporting event, or whatever type of event it is. You've got the operations and logistics folks all, running their event, and you've got the venue. But what I've seen a lot of, in a lot of cases, there's certainly room for improvement on the communication, because everyone may be communicating for their own needs among their own team, but the coordination across the teams, or straight through to the authorities, or what's the protocol? And I know, Jim, you deal with this a lot. Who's going to make the call on the weather, or who's going to, who's going to take the lead in response on the command and control.
Yeah, and I would argue that we're still in the very early days after Manchester, and this is the new norm. It is the thing that we have to prepare for most. So there is no perfect plan, but certainly not having a plan is inexcusable. And it can be very daunting to have nothing and have to write a venue plan for all of these safety considerations from the beginning. But there are other experts out there who do it all the time, who can give you a template to start from. The trick is that template isn't your plan. It's simply a framework for your plan. And if you have an evacuation, if you have a simple weather evacuation or disruption, learn from that. Come back after that disruption and get notes from everybody. Get notes from your staff all around the building and learn from that, and constantly rework your plan and constantly improve it. It's a living document. You can't park it and put it on a dusty shelf somewhere. I wanted to leave time for questions, but if you had something else you wanted to add, Greg.
Yeah, I suppose the last thing I wanted to add was, as I said, it's not rocket science. Everyone in this room can highlight safety issues. We've all walked past the generators with the 240-barrel drums of kerosene and the guy standing next to it smoking. We've all walked past the locked doors. We've all walked past the exit light that's out and said, "Ooh, yeah, that's probably not right." So everyone can do it. It's about being diligent enough to do it.
One of the questions I was asked to ask was, what new training are the venues going through, are the operational teams going through at this point in time? And I think my answer is none yet. but we haven't gotten there yet. And there are, as I said, there's the Event Safety Alliance training, but that's basic safety. That's just saying, hey, you should be taking care of yourself. First and foremost, you have your own duty of care. And the tools that go along with that. And there are other examples that are online training for crowd managers and things, which are great starters. But I would argue that we haven't had enough time yet in response to Manchester, in response to Christina Grimmie and these other events, the Pulse nightclub, to really thoroughly think out what's next, what is it we're going to be asking everybody to know when they take this role on. And that's not to be a shameless plug, but that's part of the role of the Event Safety Alliance, is to get this global community talking about these things. What's working in Singapore? What's working in Malaysia? What's working in England? By the way, one of the highest standards you can find. And how can we embrace all of the things that already exist rather than starting from scratch to propel ourselves to a better condition right now? Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I would argue that, we don't need new training at the moment. And no one needs new training until they've got the basics right, until they've got their induction plan, until they've got their risk assessments, their venue risk assessments, their threat assessments, their incident management plan. Because any new training that comes out of these incidents are going to refer to those basics. So unless we've got them right, and unless we've got our staff training right, then it's pointless sending off training around hostile vehicle mitigation or how we stop people with semi-automatic weapons coming to our venue. So the basic training, whether it's ESA, whether it's other organisations, they're the things that have to be done.
And in the process of planning, you will uncover and discover those things that need to be trained as well. It helps to identify, I don't have a person to look after making sure those doors are open or that the elevators are turned off or whatever the event might be. So planning comes first. The plans themselves don't save you, but the process of planning can save you. Did you want to add that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's also somewhat of a difference between a venue that's part of a larger company. I mean, both Greg and I work for big companies that have many venues and they have a very organized and coordinated security and safety protocol across all those.
On paper.
On paper. And I'm sure there's, I know there's a lot of work being done and a lot of attention focused on that. What I think about sometimes is, standalone venues or government-owned venues in different parts of the world. And I wonder, what are the resources that they're tapping into? Are they, on their own? Are they, approaching the same issues? And do they have the resources? Is there any sort of certification or
Yeah. I would argue that
standard that they should be living up to.
That developing it in a vacuum is not, I don't think, in the best interest of all of our safety, right? I mean, there's plenty of good examples to follow along. England has published quite a few books on it. And you're right that the big companies are certainly actively improving their plan, but it's not at its fullest until we're all running from the same playbook. And that the only thing that differs on the day is, for an artist person like myself, I'm in a different venue today, so I need to be inducted to that venue. For the venue developers and promoters, you've got specific plans at your venues, and the venue developers are having to make sure that what their plan does includes the visiting artist or the visiting football team or whatever it might be. But uniformity is in all of our best interests, so that, if a red card gets flashed on stage, it's show stop right now, get out. So that we all know to look for that anywhere we are on the planet.
And I think that's where you can close the gap between the venues and the touring artists, is that, either you're coming along with a show stop procedure saying that's what we're doing for our tour, and we need to integrate that into your life safety system and your alert system of the venue, or we accept the fact that through China or through Southeast Asia, here's going to be the standard, consistent show stop procedure. There's certain things like that where there needs to be artist buy-in as well.
Yeah, I just did Reading and Leeds, small audiences of 90,000 people. And, the protocols are pretty good there. No vehicle gets on site without it being pre-registered. The driver's license is there, and then it gets checked far off site before it goes in. It gets its parking pass before it goes in. There's a very thorough show stop procedure. There's a show stop alert light on stage. They really have it together, again, making it easier for us to follow a good example because they've put a lot of thought process into it.
Do you think here in Asia there's a lower perceived threat level? Do you think venue operators or managers or event professionals have a lower expectation of threat?
I don't think it's happened enough on this soil to raise it to the level where it is in England and Belgium and Europe and at large and in the States. Whether or not folks are more or less prepared in Asia remains to be seen. I'd like us all to be well prepared. But I don't, the most recent thing I recall in Asia was the powder party on Christmas Eve, maybe in Taiwan.
Color play.
Yeah, where they burned up a bunch of people. I mean, that goes back to that threat's much more likely to happen than a terrorist. So you've got to get those things right so you can turn your attention to these terrible other possibilities.
Well, certainly what we're finding as we move around is that the venue staff and the support staff, whether they be the crowd control agencies, the rigging companies, the event overlay companies, they don't know what they don't know, but there's a willingness to learn. So we ask them where are the certs for their trusses or their motors. Oh, we don't have those. Well, we need them. Okay, no problems at all. They'll go off and they'll get them, but they don't know what they don't know. So, and there's not a lot of consistent code that governs the live entertainment business throughout Asia. So it's an education program.
And I would argue that we don't really want the government coming in.
That's exactly right.
That's the whole point, again, of the ESA is that initially that was to stop the U.S. government from making some really horrible decisions about live performances in outdoor venues. And it was going to be bad, and we kind of came in and interceded. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, and I would argue that it's up to us, the bigger players within the industry, to create this training program and not expect it to be done overnight, but chipping away at it. We're achieving 5-6% every year, and we're getting a little bit more information, a little bit more risk management mitigation. We're getting there.
Security matters.
There you go.
Security matters. Hey, let's do questions while we've got time. Anybody? I'm going to manage the own microphone because it's faster. I got one in the back. Oh, you got it. Great. Thank you. Stand up and tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi there. Yeah, my name's Mike Hill. I run a festival in Hong Kong called Clock and Flap. We got scared about 5 years ago, realised that what we were doing was there wasn't the expertise in Hong Kong. There wasn't this expertise in the security industry. So we decided, because we're quite a bunch of geeks, that we'd go off and train ourselves. And we went off and did Keith Still's Dim Ice course in the UK. And then we've then been forced to develop our own systems and protocols because we can't find people in the industry in Asia that know this stuff, right? Okay.
It's already translated to Korean, and it's available in South Korea. I know that doesn't help you in Hong Kong, but it's a free resource.
Cool. Now, so the question I had for you guys, because we haven't talked about this, we've been indoctrinated by Dr. Stills that density is what kills. So I want to hear what you guys, because we believe this strongly. And you talk about all these other hazards and, like people with guns and stage collapses, but ultimately what's gonna kill people is them getting crushed, because we've seen this time and time again. So, and I want to hear your view on this.
Compressive asphyxiation. Go.
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right. And before we set density ratios for any pit, we consider the demographics of the individuals. So we've been doing a little bit of work at the moment with YouTube Fan Fest, and you've got people within a pit who are 4 foot high and 12 years old. So clearly the density ratio is going to be a hell of a lot greater than what we would have for a mature audience, experienced audience. We need to consider what the weather conditions are. How do we communicate with the audience? What education have we given to them prior to them coming into the pit? More often than not, with a GA pit, you're going to have people queuing outside for 3 hours. Are we taking that opportunity to talk to them and educate them? The crowd controllers who are walking up and down that line, are we talking to them about hydration, rest out of the pit? How do they communicate with us when we're pumping out 106 dB? So absolutely, density is a big issue.
And it's a bigger problem, I think, because the authorities in some regions use random math to decide what your density is going to be. And there's good science to back up what density should be, but again, it's not standalone. It's who's the artist, what's the type of crowd, what's the demo of the crowd, What's the control measures in there? How often are they broken up by a barricade? What are the escape paths by barricade, et cetera? Sorry, you had something else you wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like, you're talking about the density at the front. That's the most managed part of the venue. You've got security in the pit. You've got CCTV watching. You've got people trained to deal with that situation. But when, like you saw in Barcelona, Tomorrowland, where there was a fire, all of a sudden the density moves. It's moving back away from the stage, and it's near the exits, and it's, you know. And I'm seeing that the venues are not being designed to consider this at all. People aren't even thinking about it. It's like people are perceiving the threat to be either at the front of the stage, or there's going to be this event that's going to kill people by squashing them. But actually, what ultimately, as we see all over the world, you know, like the Love Parade and the one in Holland, I can't remember the name of it, Roskilde, etc. People, hundreds of people die at these events, you know.
Look, there's a couple of people in this room who've been bored to death of me talking to them about this on our specific events, but density is just one thing. You know, we would typically set the capacity of a pit based on the exit width, the density ratio, and how long it takes to load that pit. So we would like to, you know, and the fewer of those three numbers is what the capacity should be. So if I can't get 30,000 people within an hour inside that pit, then I can't have 30,000 people in there. If I can't get 30,000 people out of that pit within 8 minutes, then I can't have 30,000 people in that pit. And that density ratio, typically we still stick to the 0.4, which is, you know, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 average across. But that's of the viewable space, not the whole area of the pit. So there's a number of different ways that we use to calculate the density or the capacity of that pit so that we avoid that specific issue. The other thing that you really need to consider, as Jim spoke about, was the artist. You know, I've had 36,000 people on the pitch at Wembley for Muse and 36,000 people on the pitch for Take That. And believe it or not, the Take That audience was the more dangerous audience than the Muse audience, because they weren't a GA pit audience. They weren't used to it. You know, they came in, they drank champagne. It was not an overly hot day, but it was probably about 28, 29 degrees. As soon as the band came on stage, they'd faint. Half a dozen would faint, and they were held up by the density in the crowd. As soon as the band stopped the first set, they'd move, they'd fall down, and if the band didn't have long enough between their sets, that crowd would just close straight over the top of them. You know, so it's all about the demographics, the type of band, your exit ratios. There's a lot that goes into setting your pit. You know, where are your spotters? How are you communicating with the crowd? What's the show stop?
Yeah. Did we get there?
Enough
for now?
That's good.
All right, we've got a roughly 3 minutes. I'm lying. It says 2, but I'm going to say 3. Anybody else? Nothing?
I'll add something.
Go, would you?
Yeah, sure. I think what's important as well is, you know, all of the science and all of the expertise that you can apply in your event is going to help and make your event safe. And certainly for the events that we put on and the events that Greg's involved with or you do, that, you know, that's of importance to all of us. But what's also important is the events we don't do, that someone else is doing in the same venue or in the same city or in the same, you know, format, festival or whatever, that we all, you know, that we're all engaged in our businesses. If we're not taking care of our industry together, then we're going to have more life safety incidents or more security problems that's going to affect us all. And I know it's something we've talked about over the years, and it's got to get further along.
Well, and thanks, Rob. You can't only think about inside that venue space either. I personally had an experience in South Africa where out in the parking lot of the stadium, a branding partner had come in via the promoter and erected a scaffolding over the main entranceway. That branding partner hired another partner who hired a scaffolding company to put the scaffolding company up. And just before the show, that scaffolding blew over and killed the girl who was hosting the band at the hotel that they had invited to the show. And that's horrible. And it's outside mine as the artist's duty of care. It's on you, the promoter's duty of care, and you, the venue manager's duty of care. If you're bringing them onto your site and they're erecting a structure That structure has to be safe, and that's your problem. And the worst part about this incident in South Africa is it had all of the governmental safety checks. All of the boxes were ticked, and there was a signature on the bottom of it. But when you lifted up the skirt of what was happening around that tower, not 1 ounce of ballast. In a known high wind area, every night when the sun goes down, the wind picks up. So, again, safety by paper is not a solution. Safety by action is the solution. Don't kill somebody. That's not the entertainment business's job.
And I think also that there's no excuse not to learn from past disasters. I mean, everyone's got their PC, their phones. Type in stadium disaster and have a look at the last, not even the last 30 years, the last 10 years, this is still happening. You know, and from that, you'll very quickly understand how these things have happened and how avoidable they were. But what that also does is that gives you a bit of an insight into what you should be looking at for your next event, what could potentially happen.
So our time is up. No last questions? Greg Gillen, thank you. Rob Spitzer, thank you very much. Jimmy Chan's at the back of the house with some brochures on the Event Safety Alliance. Thank you all very much. Stay safe.